Okay, now we're going to look at hydrogen bonds. So we've looked at dispersion forces, dipole interactions. Now we're at hydrogen bonds. Dispersion forces are obviously our weakest. Dipoles are stronger than dispersion forces. Now we're going to get to hydrogen bonds, which is actually going to be the strongest of the three. So hydrogen bonds are really similar to the dipole. All right, so they're polar bonds, but what makes them special are the presence of lone pair electrons. So if you got this far with uh, covalent molecules, you know that some molecules have these unbonded pairs of electrons that are associated with the atom, and they create these large areas of electronegativity. So if we go back to our like VSEPR theory, these electrons take up space and push our molecules into certain shapes. So water, which is the example here, has this bend shape because it's got these lone pairs that are pushing the hydrogen atoms down. And there are other examples, like another example would be pneumonia, right? NH3. Nitrogen has 5 valence electrons, right? It bonds to 3 hydrogen atoms, right? And it has this sort of pyramidal shape to it because those lone pairs need all this space. Okay, so now it's created this like area of electronegativity, right? This is like this negative area. And then you have all these like partial positive areas. So the bonds, remember, the bonds are going to be polar, right? So if we're looking at ammonia as my example, we point these arrows, and then we have this like overall direction, right, in the molecule towards here, right? So, right, hydrogen bonds are going to occur with the presence of lone pairs of electrons. So if you look at the atoms that commonly have these, you're going to look at fluorine, chlorine, oxygen, and nitrogen. So if you have a polar bond, and a polar covalent molecule where you have these atoms, there's probably going to be hydrogen bonds involved. And there's going to be they're strongly polar, right? And so they have a stronger dipole. So we talked about this in terms of the partial positive and partial negative. There's a strong partial negative because of the presence of those lone pairs. So that's what makes them stronger than the dipole. Their dipole is stronger. So these dashed lines throughout all of these represent these attractive forces. They're not bonds, they're just forces that are holding them together. So in my example here, if this is water, and I didn't put the lone pairs up in this diagram, but you can see them here. The orange is the oxygen, the blue is the hydrogen, and then each have 2 lone pairs. So these lone pairs attract to the hydrogens, and that's how we have what's called a hydrogen bond. Hydrogen bonds, you actually find those in DNA. So if you have the double helix of DNA, it's held together, right, by hydrogen bonds. And then they're weak enough that they can be pulled apart so the strands can be replicated and then come back together. So hydrogen bonds are pretty important um, in biology. Okay, so if we're doing our tug of war scenario, right, it's still not as strong as an ionic bond in the tug of war scenario, but this guy, kind of like the dipole, he's strong, right? And in the tug of war scenario, and he's pulling, but maybe he's just like teasing. He's just doing it one-handed, right? He's got a lot of energy, and he can just kind of like switch between hands and tease this guy for a long time. It's not gonna pull him over. These are still relatively weak forces, right? But it's pretty strong, right? You know, he's gonna be constantly hanging on to that rope. So this is at the far end of the 3 forces that we're looking at, the strongest of those. And our key identifier is atoms with lone pairs. Okay. So if they don't have lone pairs, if they're not in this list of atoms, then it's polar, then you're probably looking at dipole interactions. Otherwise, you're looking at hydrogen bonds.